What if I told you that the world today should have twice as many people? That we missed out on centuries of artistic and scientific advancement? That the Renaissance could have happened 200 years earlier and been 10 times more spectacular? The year is 1347. Ships arrive in European ports carrying more than just trade goods. They carry fleas infected with a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. Within 5 years, this microscopic organism will kill between 75 and 200 million people, wiping out 30 to 60% of Europe's population in what history calls the Black Death. But what if those ships had been turned away? What if medieval quarantine procedures had worked? What if the Black Death, the most devastating pandemic in human history, had never spread beyond its origins in Central Asia? By the end of this exploration, you'll understand how preventing this single pandemic could have accelerated human progress by centuries, created a world with radically different population patterns, and transformed the entire trajectory of Western civilization. The ripple effects would be so profound that our world today would be utterly unrecognizable. To understand what we lost, we need to appreciate what Europe was becoming before 1347. The High Middle Ages had been a period of unprecedented growth and innovation. The population had been steadily increasing for 3 centuries. New agricultural techniques were feeding more people than ever before. Gothic cathedrals were reaching toward the heavens, demonstrating engineering prowess that rivaled ancient Rome. These weren't just religious buildings. They were showcases of mathematical precision, architectural innovation, and organizational capability that required the coordination of hundreds of skilled craftsmen over decades. Universities in Paris, Oxford, and Bologna were preserving and expanding human knowledge. Medieval scholars were already beginning to question Aristotelian physics. Mathematical knowledge was expanding through contact with Islamic scholarship. Experimental approaches to understanding nature were emerging in monasteries and schools across Europe. Medieval Europe was on the verge of intellectual breakthroughs that would be delayed by centuries. The Black Death didn't just kill bodies, it killed minds. The scholars, artists, and innovators who died took with them ideas and discoveries that might have transformed the world 200 years earlier than they actually did. In our alternate timeline where the Black Death never spreads beyond Asia, Europe's population continues its upward trajectory. By 1400, instead of struggling to recover from demographic catastrophe, Europe houses nearly 100 million people, double the actual historical population. This isn't just about numbers. More people means more minds working on problems, more hands building infrastructure, more consumers driving economic growth. With double the population, Europe has twice as many potential geniuses, twice as many skilled craftsmen, twice as many resources to invest in innovation and expansion. The agricultural innovations that were developing before 1347 continue to advance without interruption. The 3-field system evolves into more sophisticated crop rotation methods. New plow designs increase productivity. Without massive population loss, there's continuous pressure to improve farming methods to feed growing cities. By 1450, European cities look completely different from our timeline. Paris houses 400,000 people instead of 200,000. London, Florence, and Venice have grown into massive urban centers that dwarf their historical counterparts. These aren't just larger versions of medieval cities. They're more sophisticated, with better infrastructure and more complex economies. The guild system, instead of stagnating after demographic collapse, continues evolving and innovating. Master craftsmen have more apprentices to train, more resources to experiment with, more demand for their products. The mechanical innovations that historically appeared sporadically begin emerging more frequently and systematically. Trade networks that were disrupted historically by plague continue expanding without interruption. European merchants maintain and strengthen connections with Asia and Africa. The economic foundation for later exploration and expansion develops 150 years earlier than in our timeline. Here's where our alternate timeline takes its first dramatic turn. Without the demographic catastrophe of the Black Death, the intellectual and artistic movement we call the Renaissance begins in the late 14th century instead of the 15th. And it's not just earlier, it's more spectacular. The rediscovery of classical texts and artistic techniques that characterizes the Renaissance happens more gradually and thoroughly when there are more scholars alive to pursue it. Instead of a few brilliant individuals like Petrarch leading the revival of classical learning, hundreds of intellectuals across Europe are simultaneously engaging with ancient texts. Universities don't lose their faculty to plague, so the institutional knowledge that took centuries to rebuild in our timeline continues accumulating without interruption. By 1400, European universities have become centers of learning that rival anything in the Islamic world or ancient Rome. The experimental approach to understanding nature that emerged in the 13th century continues developing without the massive intellectual disruption of plague. By 1420, European scholars are conducting systematic experiments in optics, mechanics, and astronomy that our timeline wouldn't see until the scientific revolution. The printing press, when it arrives around 1400 in our alternate timeline, finds a much larger literate population ready to consume printed books. Instead of slowly spreading literacy, printing accelerates an already existing trend toward widespread education and intellectual engagement. By 1500, European cities have become showcases of artistic and architectural achievement that dwarf the historical Renaissance. Florence, Paris, and Venice have become massive cultural centers with populations exceeding anything in our timeline until the modern era. Art production scales up dramatically. Instead of a few genius artists like Leonardo and Michelangelo, Europe has hundreds of highly skilled artists working in dozens of thriving cultural centers. The artistic output of our alternate Renaissance is 10 times greater than the historical version. But here's where our alternate timeline really diverges from history. The age of exploration begins 100 years earlier and with much greater resources behind it. European population pressure and technological advancement combine to drive expansion that dwarfs the historical colonization period. European expeditions reached the Americas in the 1420s, not through accident like Columbus, but through systematic exploration enabled by advanced navigation techniques and larger resource bases. These aren't desperate expeditions seeking new trade routes. They're well-funded scientific and commercial ventures. More importantly, the encounter between Europeans and American civilizations takes a completely different form. Europeans arrive with more advanced medical knowledge, better understanding of disease transmission, and more sophisticated diplomatic and administrative experience gained from managing diverse populations in Europe. Meanwhile, back in Europe, the technological and economic development that was delayed by plague continues accelerating. By 1550, European cities have achieved levels of mechanical sophistication that our timeline wouldn't reach until the early Industrial Revolution. Agricultural productivity reaches levels that support urban populations of unprecedented size. European cities begin approaching population densities that our timeline wouldn't see until the 19th century. But with medieval and early Renaissance technology adapted and improved over centuries of continuous development. The scientific revolution that transformed our world in the 16th and 17th centuries begins in the late 1400s in our alternate timeline. But it's not just earlier, it's more thorough and systematic because it builds on centuries of uninterrupted intellectual development. European universities have become massive institutions with international reach. The University of Paris has 15,000 students. Oxford and Cambridge together enroll 8,000. These aren't just teaching institutions. They're research centers that systematically advance human knowledge across all fields. Manufacturing begins to mechanize in the late 1500s, 2 centuries before our timeline's Industrial Revolution. Guild systems evolve into more sophisticated forms of production organization. European cities become centers of mechanical innovation that produce goods for global markets. European trade networks span the globe by 1600. Regular shipping connects Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. This isn't just extraction and exploitation. It's systematic economic development that benefits multiple civilizations through technology transfer and cultural exchange. Now here's where our alternate timeline becomes truly extraordinary. The scientific revolution that redefined human understanding of the natural world happens 150 years earlier, and with far greater intensity. European scholars are making discoveries in physics, chemistry, and biology that our timeline wouldn't achieve until the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment begins in the early 1600s instead of the early 1700s. But unlike our historical Enlightenment, which had to overcome centuries of intellectual stagnation, this earlier version builds on continuous philosophical and scientific development spanning 3 centuries. Steam power appears in the 1640s, 120 years before our timeline. European engineers, building on centuries of mechanical innovation, develop practical steam engines that revolutionize mining, manufacturing, and transportation. The Industrial Revolution begins in the mid-1600s. European cities undergo massive transformation as steam power enables large-scale manufacturing. London reaches 800,000 people by 1700. Paris exceeds 1 million. These aren't just larger medieval cities. They're early industrial centers with infrastructure and organization that our timeline wouldn't develop until the 1800s. Transportation revolutionizes European society in the late 1600s. Steam-powered vehicles begin connecting major cities. Communication systems enable rapid information transfer across the continent. Europe becomes an integrated economic and cultural unit 2 centuries before our timeline achieved similar integration. By 1700, European influence has spread globally, but in forms very different from our historical colonialism. Instead of extraction-based empires, Europeans have established cooperative relationships with civilizations worldwide, sharing technology and knowledge while developing global trade networks. European science in the 1700s reaches levels of sophistication that our timeline wouldn't achieve until the 1800s. Major discoveries in physics, chemistry, and biology transform understanding of the natural world. European scientists begin discussing concepts that our timeline wouldn't develop until the modern era. The Industrial Revolution reaches full maturity in the mid-1700s. European manufacturing produces goods at scales that supply global markets. Steam power has transformed transportation, mining, and agriculture. European cities have become industrial centers that dwarf anything in our historical timeline. European urban development reaches unprecedented levels. Cities implement sophisticated infrastructure for water, sanitation, and transportation. Urban planning becomes a systematic discipline. European cities in 1750 have achieved living standards that our timeline wouldn't reach until the late 1800s. Electrical experimentation begins seriously in the 1730s, 40 years before our timeline. European scientists, building on centuries of systematic research, develop understanding of electrical phenomena that leads to practical applications decades earlier than in our history. Agricultural science advances to levels that support massive urban populations. Mechanical farming techniques, improved crop varieties, and systematic land management produce food surpluses that free enormous numbers of people for industrial and intellectual work. European exploration and settlement by 1800 has created a globally integrated civilization. Advanced transportation and communication connect continents. Scientific expeditions systematically study global geography, biology, and culture. The world becomes an integrated system 2 centuries early. As we enter the 1800s in our alternate timeline, European technology has reached levels that our world wouldn't achieve until the late 1800s or early 1900s. Electrical power begins transforming cities. Manufacturing achieves unprecedented scales of production. Transportation networks connect global markets efficiently. European cities have become massive metropolitan centers. London exceeds 2 million people. Paris approaches 1.5 million. These aren't just large industrial cities. They're cultural and intellectual centers that rival anything our timeline has produced, with infrastructure and organization that supports massive populations efficiently. European science has made discoveries that fundamentally transform understanding of matter, energy, and life. The scientific method, refined over centuries, produces breakthrough discoveries at an accelerating pace. European scientists begin discussing concepts related to atomic structure and energy that our timeline wouldn't develop until the 20th century. European society has achieved levels of education, health, and prosperity that create conditions for unprecedented cultural and intellectual flowering. Mass education produces literate populations capable of participating in complex technological and economic systems. By 1900, our alternate timeline has produced a globally integrated civilization with European leadership that has achieved technological and social advancement comparable to our world in the mid-20th century. But this advancement came through continuous development rather than the disrupted, conflict-ridden path of our actual history. European cities in 1900 have electrical lighting, advanced transportation systems, and infrastructure that supports populations of unprecedented size. Urban planning has become a sophisticated science that creates livable cities for millions of people while maintaining high standards of health and culture. Technological achievement in 1900 includes powered flight, advanced electrical systems, and manufacturing capabilities that produce goods for global markets. European engineers have solved technical problems that our timeline wouldn't address until the mid-20th century. European influence by 1900 has created a globally integrated civilization based on cooperation rather than exploitation. Technological and cultural exchange between civilizations has produced advancement that benefits all participants rather than creating the conflicts that characterized our timeline's colonial period. Scientific understanding has reached levels that allow Europeans to manipulate matter and energy in ways that seem almost magical compared to our historical timeline. Understanding of atomic structure, electromagnetic phenomena, and biological processes enables technological applications that our timeline wouldn't develop until the latter half of the 20th century. By 1900, the difference between our timeline and the alternate timeline, where the Black Death never happened, has become staggering. Where our world was just beginning to electrify cities and experiment with powered flight, the alternate world has achieved technological and social advancement that our timeline wouldn't reach until the latter half of the 20th century. The implications for our modern world are mind-boggling. If the Black Death had never happened, humanity could have achieved by 1900 what our timeline has only recently accomplished. Global communication, advanced transportation, sophisticated manufacturing, and international cooperation could have been established centuries earlier. But perhaps most importantly, this alternate timeline demonstrates the incredible potential of human civilization when development proceeds without massive disruption. The Black Death didn't just kill a third of Europe's population. It interrupted centuries of accumulated progress and forced humanity to rebuild from a much lower starting point. The lesson for our modern world is clear. Protecting human knowledge, institutions, and population from catastrophic disruption isn't just about surviving disasters. It's about preserving the continuous accumulation of human achievement that makes advanced civilization possible. The loss of the Black Death's victims was more than a tragedy. It was a theft of human potential that delayed our civilization by centuries. Understanding what we lost when plague devastated medieval Europe helps us appreciate what we could achieve if we protect and build upon the knowledge and institutions that enable human advancement. The story of what might have been if the Black Death never happened is ultimately a story about human potential that remains available to us if we have the wisdom to preserve what we've learned and the determination to continue growing.